What's up everybody, my name is Moonface Nick. I've been on a mission to beat 100 video games every year since 2020, and today, without discussing any spoilers, we're going to go over each of the 9 games that I beat in July, ranked not by objective quality, but by how happy they made me. So let's kick it off with number 9, Super Mario Land. I've been playing a lot of older games lately, and the Mario entries are some of my very favorites, but this one isn't quite up to the same standard. I get that it's a Game Boy launch title, and I'm old enough to remember that it would have been extremely impressive to have a full game like this available on the go given the technical limitations of the era. But the fact is, most Game Boy companion games like this are very basic versions of their console counterparts, and playing them side by side in 2024, they just aren't as impressive. And it doesn't help that I'm playing on a much larger screen than originally intended, which probably contributed to the imprecise platforming and hitbox issues that might have barely been noticeable on handheld. They did take some pretty big swings with game design, the enemy variety was notable, the boss fights were fairly interesting, and the flying levels were actually pretty great. But while the other early Mario games all laid the groundwork for iconic characters and settings in this universe, the weird Egyptian backdrop and kung fu style enemies seen here never exactly screamed Mario to me. I don't want to be overly harsh because if I'm a 9-year-old with a Game Boy in my hands, this is great, but playing them in order now, this is easily my least favorite so far. Up next at number 8 is Nobody Wants to Die. This brand new detective thriller takes a bunch of familiar pieces and mashes them into a very unique final product, and some of it totally works while some of it really doesn't. The real star of the show is the world they built. Think Blade Runner meets Bioshock meets film noir. It's absolutely dazzling. And seeing well-known backdrops like Central Park and Liberty Island through this gritty dystopian lens is genuinely impressive to behold. The core gameplay loop is using all these cool detective tools to piece together the aftermath of a crime scene, but here's where it actually starts to lose me a bit. Some games don't lead you on enough, but this has the opposite problem. It's constantly holding your hand and dragging you forward. There's literally always an objective marker right in front of your face, to the point that most of the experience is just hitting buttons as directed until you solve the case. I never really learned how to use anything, and before I knew it, the investigation was over and I was on to the next scene, having gained no real grasp of what was happening. I do have a problem with going on autopilot mentally if the game allows it, but at the end of the day, I felt like this kind of played itself, and that wasn't very satisfying. Coming in at number 7 is Life is Strange Before the Storm. I'm playing these in order before Double Exposure comes out in October, and I love the first one, so I was expecting a lot going into this, but I was mostly disappointed. Some of it's just preference, like I really love the supernatural aspects of the original and how crazy it got toward the end, and this is more of a simple, straightforward teen angst drama. But it wasn't just preference. Almost immediately I noticed what I could only describe as a dip in production value. The animations were off, the writing wasn't as snappy, and all the voice actors were different. I especially missed Ashley Birch as Chloe. The replacement did an okay job, but Ashley Birch is Ashley Birch. You're not going to easily match that performance with some rando. I also found some of the scenes to be totally unbelievable. They just didn't make sense within the context of the story, which really pulled me out of it a few times. I was so confused because I couldn't understand why this felt lower in quality, and it wasn't until I was playing episode 2 that I realized it's a completely different developer. I do think Deck 9 did a fairly good job with the property, but the original was excellent, and I just don't see Before the Storm as good enough to meet that very high standard. Moving on to number 6, it's Mega Man 5. I've been playing these in order of release, and for the most part I find that they keep getting progressively better, and this 5th entry is easily my favorite so far. It's just the right level of difficult without being unfair or broken, and the boss fights were the best examples yet of challenges that, while tough, can totally be mastered with enough patience and focus. I was a little nervous I might hate the final few bosses like I did in Mega Man 4, but even these managed to be really tough without crossing that line into frustrating or janky. That distinct Mega Man illustration style continues to evolve here into one of the most iconic in any game series, and the music and sound design are as vibrant as ever. I really only had one minor gripe. In Mega Man 3 and 4, one of the running staples is that the levels are littered with large mini-bosses that do a great job of keeping things fresh. I literally only counted one real mini-boss throughout this entire game. It's almost as if they started to build them in and just ran out of time or something. But aside from that one insignificant issue, I love that Capcom keeps finding ways to improve on the Mega Man formula as time goes on, and I'm excited to see where things go from here. Now we're on to the top 5 with Far Cry 3. I've been putting off this series for way too long, and now that I've finally gotten around to playing the third entry, let me just tell you, it definitely lives up to the hype. The Ubisoft open world formula may have become stale recently, but this is one of the first games that tested so many of those now well-known tropes, and largely to great success. And even though it came out before big names like The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite, the quality of the voice acting, motion capture, writing, and overall storytelling is on that very same incredible level. It actually makes me a bit sad that I didn't play this when it was new, because it probably would have been one of my favorite games of all time. But nowadays I'm more comfortable with modern mechanics and polish, so I did find parts of this masterpiece to be a bit dated and frustrating by today's standards. The combat's solid but a little floaty, the UI is cluttered with all kinds of stuff I don't need, and a lot of the side content, while interesting, felt unnecessary because it wasn't worth the rewards. Overall, this is maybe the best example yet of a title that deserves a god tier ranking based on objective quality, but won't quite get one because I'm unfairly partial to more modern gameplay. Next up is Flintlock: The Siege of Dawn at number 4. As a huge fan of Souls-likes, I came into this expecting to have a lot of fun, and I did, but I also have to admit it's got some flaws. Design-wise, everything was impressive. The game looked and sounded great, the voice acting was on point, and the story, while not entirely unique, went in some very interesting directions. And the side quests are actually meaningful. I usually don't bother, but if you're gonna give me more health or awesome gear every time I finish one, sure, I'll do a few. The combat has a ton of variety, but it's also finicky. Movement is floaty, the hitboxes can be unreliable, and I kept using the wrong attacks because the button presses and holds are very particular. The boss fights are also really weird. In the first phase, nobody's doing much damage, so it takes forever, but then their insane second phase starts and suddenly one of you is dead within seconds. Honestly, the biggest problem was a bug that would straight up crash the game if you tried to check your map or inventory while moving, but hopefully they'll address that with a patch soon. Overall, I'd say this is a solid B-tier entry, and while it's not totally a Souls-like through and through, if you're into that genre, there's still a lot to sink your teeth into here. In third place, we've got Tales of Iron. This originally piqued my interest because Wikipedia had it listed as a Souls-like, and while I'm not sure I agree with that label, it is an immense amount of fun. The 2D pop-up book art style fits perfectly with the dark but whimsical Grimm's fairy tale-esque plotline that knows when to tug your heartstrings and when to keep it light. There's a little Souls-like sprinkled in with the slow, deliberate combat, but there's no corpse run, stamina management, universal leveling currency, or any of the other classic Souls-like attributes. That being said, it can be brutal, and I especially enjoyed the tough-as-nails boss fights. They're very good at teaching you to get better, and every time you die, it's easy to see what you did wrong. There's also a little Metroidvania mixed in, although it's a bit too linear for the genre, and you could even consider it somewhat of a 2D action platformer. But the controls that make for great combat don't translate well to exploration, and probably the worst part of the game is simply getting from point A to point B with the slow and imprecise climbing and jumping. All in all, Tales of Iron is well worth playing if you love great combat and tricky boss fights, and now I can't wait to play the upcoming sequel set to release later this year. Just missing the number 1 spot is Dungeons of Hinterberg at number 2. I didn't expect much from this unassuming indie dungeon crawler when I booted it up, but it turned out to be one of my favorite games of the whole year. Just the format is the definition of addictive. Go out during the day to conquer one of the 25 highly variable dungeons, come back at night to improve your gear and make new friendships for more battle perks, rinse and repeat. The combat isn't terribly tough unless you wander into the wrong area, but the variety of skills and attacks that vary depending on which biome you're in keeps things fresh and interesting. The puzzles range from fairly simple to surprisingly tricky, and the items and equipables you can win for completing dungeons and combat challenges are usually of significant value. The story you're shown between runs does a great job of drip feeding the story to you in bite-sized pieces that keeps you guessing all the way through. It wasn't perfect. The boss fights were few and far between and way too easy on normal difficulty, and there were some bugs with traversal and the camera angle that were highly annoying at times. But all in all, I was extremely impressed with what I just decided to try on a whim because it was on Game Pass day one, and even if you don't have Game Pass, I'd say it's easily worth the $30. And finally, my number 1 favorite game I beat in July is the First Descendant. I almost passed on this free-to-play looter shooter because sometimes these games don't have a well-defined campaign, but boy am I glad I decided to try it. Not only is the campaign clearly laid out and totally free, it's also absolutely massive, taking me well over 30 hours to see it all the way through just doing the required missions. The loot grind is addictive, the gunplay is excellent, the missions have a ton of variety, and the boss fights are insanely epic. I never paid real money for anything, and I did hit a wall around halfway through, but I just had to grind gear to get through it. I don't even know what I could have paid for to make it easier. I will say the story was super dumb and generic. I just started straight up skipping all the dialogue to get back to the action. My only serious complaint was that the servers were really struggling for the entire week plus I was playing. I lost hours of progress just getting booted to the menu over and over. But that'll certainly improve over time, and if you adore looter shooters as much as I do, you have to play this. It blew me away, and I could see this one actually surviving for a while. So that wraps up the month of July, and it brings us to a total of 71 games beaten so far in 2024, and a grand total of 518 since we started doing this way back in 2020. Remember to click like if you enjoyed the video, and next month we'll be playing Black Myth Wukong, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, Star Wars Outlaws, and much, much more. So feel free to subscribe if you want to see what takes the #1 spot in August.